Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories. James had been looking for a way to start over. After a string of failed relationships, mounting debts, and a job that drained the life out of him, he decided to escape. When he saw the listing for a forest watchtower position in northern Montana, he didn't hesitate. Remote, snowy, and far from the chaos of city life, it was exactly what he needed. The watchtower was located in Blackwood National Forest, a sprawling wilderness known for its dense pine trees, heavy snowfall, and rugged isolation. James packed his things, bought a sturdy winter coat, and drove his old truck across the state line. After hours of winding roads and climbing elevation, he finally arrived at the ranger station. The head ranger, a burly man named Tom, briefed him on his duties. "Your main job is to keep an eye out for forest fires and any unusual activity. We've got hunters, snowmobilers, and sometimes poachers who like to test their luck. If you see anything suspicious, use the radio to report it. And don't forget, storms roll in quick up there. Stay alert." Tom handed him a two-way radio, an old but reliable device. Channel 1 connects you to us. Channel 2 is for emergencies only. Weather updates come in every morning. And don't worry, we'll check in daily. The tower itself was perched on a hill deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow trail that James had to hike. The structure stood tall against the snowy backdrop, its wooden frame creaking slightly in the wind. The cabin at the top was small but functional, with a bed, a wood stove, a desk, and wide windows offering a panoramic view of the snowy landscape. James settled in quickly. His first few days were uneventful, quiet hikes through snow-covered trails, the distant howl of wolves at night, and the soft crackle of the radio as rangers checked in. The solitude was exactly what he had hoped for. But on his fifth day, things took a sinister turn. James had spent the morning walking the trails, his boots crunching through the snow as he inspected the forest for anything unusual. When he returned to the tower, something immediately felt off. One of the cabin windows was shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor, and the freezing wind howled through the opening, scattering snowflakes inside. Frowning, James set down his pack and scanned the area. The snow around the base of the tower was disturbed, footprints. Someone had been here. Climbing the steps cautiously, he checked the cabin. Apart from the broken window, everything seemed undisturbed. But then he noticed the prints inside, a single, muddy boot print leading toward the shattered glass. It was large, too large to be his own. He grabbed the radio and switched to channel 1. "Tom, this is James at Tower 3. Someone's been here, my window's broken, and there are footprints. Over." Static crackled for a moment before Tom's voice came through, calm but firm. "Copy that, James. Can you tell how fresh the tracks are? Over." James looked out the window, his breath fogging in the cold air. The sun was beginning to set, painting the forest in golden light. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. "They're fresh," he said, gripping the radio tighter. "And whoever it was, they're still out there." James waited, the radio still in his hand, but there was no response from Tom. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature dropped quickly as the sun sank behind the mountains. He couldn't afford to sit and wait, whoever had been there was still nearby, and he couldn't ignore the strange feeling creeping over him. His mind raced, running through the possibilities. Could it be poachers? Vandals? Or something worse? He had no way of knowing. The thought of being alone, miles from anyone, in the middle of a vast forest, felt suddenly overwhelming. The footsteps around the tower hadn't returned. He leaned out of the broken window again, scanning the thick line of trees, but saw nothing. The snow had begun to fall harder, the flurries swirling around the base of the tower and reducing visibility to only a few feet. James slowly moved to the corner of the cabin, where his pack was resting. He unzipped it and pulled out the rifle he'd been issued when he arrived, a standard-issue hunting rifle with a few spare rounds. He hadn't intended to use it, but now it felt like a necessity. With the gun in hand, he checked the radio again, hoping for an update. Nothing. No static. No voice. It was just dead air. Tom, do you copy? Over, he said again, but the radio remained silent. He needed to stay calm. He knew the forest better now after several days, so at least he had that. James checked the door to the cabin and pulled on his heavy coat, securing his gloves and boots. There was no use staying cooped up if someone was out there. Before leaving, he grabbed a small flashlight, checked his knife, and slung the rifle over his shoulder. His mind buzzed with uncertainty, but he had to act. With one last look at the broken window, he stepped out into the snow, the cold biting at his face. The snow muffled his steps, but the silence of the woods felt wrong. The deeper he walked, the more he felt like he was being watched. The trees were dark, their branches heavy with snow, and the fading light made the forest seem to stretch endlessly. He moved slowly, listening intently for any sounds, anything that could give him a clue about what had happened or who had been at the tower. Suddenly, there was a noise, distant, but unmistakable. The crunch of boots in the snow, coming from the east, toward the clearing by the stream. James stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't sure if the sound was from one person or more, but it was too close for comfort. He ducked behind a large pine tree, the rifle raised instinctively. His pulse quickened, and he felt his breath fogging in the cold air. He had no idea what to expect. Whoever was out there could be friendly, or they could be dangerous. His only advantage was the element of surprise, and he had to use it wisely. For a few minutes, the sound stopped. James held his breath, waiting. The forest around him was deathly still, the only movement the slow, steady fall of snowflakes. Then, just as he began to think he might have imagined the whole thing, the figure appeared. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a worn winter jacket and heavy boots, stepped into the clearing, scanning the area as if he were looking for something, or someone. James' heart pounded in his chest. The man hadn't seen him. He was alone, but that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. James stayed still, watching as the stranger moved cautiously toward the edge of the forest, where the trail leading to the tower began. What now? James had to decide, confront him or retreat. But either way, he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let this man get too close to the tower. If he did, it could be the end of his peace. And maybe his safety. James' fingers tightened around the rifle. The figure in the clearing moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if aware of his surroundings but not expecting anyone else to be there. He had no idea who this man was or what his intentions were, but his gut told him that this was no coincidence. The man was getting closer to the trail. James couldn't let him get any nearer to the tower. He took a deep breath, carefully adjusted his grip on the rifle, and began moving silently through the trees, keeping to the cover of the thick pines. He kept a steady eye on the stranger, making sure not to make a sound. The snow made his every step more difficult, but it also muffled the sound of his movement. The man ahead of him seemed unaware of his approach, still focused on the forest ahead. James felt the cold bite at his face, but he kept his body warm with careful movements, trying to keep his thoughts clear. As he neared the clearing, he saw the man stop near a large boulder by the stream, crouching down and reaching into his pack. James halted behind a thick tree, watching the stranger's every move. He could feel the tension mounting in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to act, but his mind told him to wait. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the distant rush of the stream, the occasional whistle of the wind through the branches, and the steady thrum of his heartbeat. James could hear his own breath in the cold air, sharp and shallow. He knew if he made any mistake now, it could cost him everything. Then, the man stood up and turned back toward the forest, adjusting his pack and seemingly looking around, as if to make sure he hadn't been spotted. That was his chance. James stepped from behind the tree, keeping the rifle low, his eyes fixed on the stranger. He wasn't going to let him slip away. "Stop!" James called out, his voice cutting through the cold silence of the forest. The man froze mid-step, his body stiffening. Slowly, he turned to face James, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only noise now was the soft rustling of the wind. James tightened his grip on the rifle. He didn't want to escalate things, but he couldn't take any chances. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly raised his hands, as if to show he was unarmed. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice calm but laced with tension. "I'm just trying to get out of the storm. My truck broke down about 5 miles back. I've been walking for hours. I'm just looking for shelter." James studied him for a moment, weighing his options. The man seemed sincere, but his presence out here, so far from any road, still didn't add up. Something felt off. "I'm alone out here," James said slowly, trying to gauge the man's reaction. "What are you really looking for?" The stranger hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I didn't come here for trouble. My name's Matt. I've been on the road for a while. I know this probably looks strange, but I'm not a threat." James's instinct screamed at him to keep the rifle aimed, but something in Matt's tone made him pause. The cold wind whipped around them, and the situation felt more surreal by the second. Finally, James spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Stay where you are. I'll call it in. If you're telling the truth, you can wait here. If not, we'll deal with it." Matt nodded quickly, his eyes flicking nervously between James and the snow-covered ground. James stepped back slowly, his gaze never leaving the stranger, and pulled the radio from his belt. "Tom, do you copy? Over." There was a crackle of static, followed by the familiar voice of the head ranger. "James? What's going on? Over. I've got a man here. Claims his truck broke down and he's been walking for miles, no sign of anyone else, but something doesn't feel right. I need you to confirm if anyone else is in the area. Over." There was a pause. "Stay put, James. We'll check the logs, but it's a slow day. We'll have someone out there as soon as we can. Just hold tight. Over." James turned back to Matt, his grip still tight on the rifle. He wasn't sure what to think. The stranger's story seemed plausible, but everything about this situation felt wrong. Why had Matt walked so far into the forest? And why was he so far from the road, in the middle of a winter storm? As the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence, James knew he had to make a choice: stay with Matt and wait for confirmation, or take matters into his own hands. Either way, he couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was very, very off about this encounter. James kept his eyes on Matt, who had sat down on a nearby boulder, his hands resting in his lap. The tension between them was palpable, both men sizing each other up in the cold, quiet forest. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He kept his rifle at the ready, though the urge to lower it was strong. The radio crackled again. "James, this is Tom. We've checked the logs. No record of any vehicles breaking down in your area. We're sending someone to confirm. Hold tight, over." The words hit James like a blow to the chest. No record? That was odd. The man had claimed his truck broke down, but why hadn't anyone else reported anything? Why hadn't Matt mentioned it before? James took a slow breath and glanced back at Matt, who seemed to be watching the snow falling in the distance, his face unreadable. "I need you to be honest with me, Matt," James said, his voice firm but calm. "Why are you really here? What were you doing at the tower earlier?" Matt's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something James couldn't identify crossing his face. He slowly stood up, his posture stiff. "I wasn't at your tower," he said, his voice low and measured. "I swear, I haven't been near it. I just got lost in the snow and—" James cut him off, his patience wearing thin. "I saw the tracks leading to the tower. I'm not buying the truck breakdown story. There's no way you wandered this far without knowing exactly where you were going. Who are you working for, Matt?" The stranger hesitated for a long moment, his gaze shifting, as if weighing whether or not to lie. Finally, he let out a long breath, as if resigning himself to the truth. "You're right," Matt admitted. "I'm not here because my truck broke down. I was looking for something. Someone hired me to track someone down who was supposed to be here, at the tower." James felt a cold pit form in his stomach. "Who hired you? And why here?" Matt's eyes met his. "I can't say. But whoever's in charge, they know the forest better than you do. And they wanted the tower unguarded. For a reason." Before James could respond, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The sound of movement, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, suddenly broke through the snowstorm's quiet. James's heart raced as he spun toward the sound, instinctively raising the rifle. Through the haze of snow, figures began to emerge from the trees, for men, all heavily armed and dressed in dark winter gear. Their faces were hidden behind masks, their presence menacing. "Looks like you've got company," Matt said quietly, his voice almost regretful. James's mind raced. He had no idea who these men were, but they clearly weren't here to help. This wasn't a coincidence anymore, it was a setup. The leader of the group stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind. "James, I assume? We've been looking for you. You've been in the way of our operations long enough." James's pulse quickened, but he kept his rifle steady. "I don't know who you are, but you're not taking this tower. I won't let you." The leader chuckled, the sound harsh and cold. "This isn't about the tower. It's about the information you've been guarding. You have no idea what's really going on here, do you?" James's grip tightened around the rifle, and his mind raced for an escape plan. He couldn't take them all down alone, but he wasn't going down without a fight. His eyes darted to the trees surrounding them. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, there was a burst of static from the radio. "James, this is Tom. We've got your location. Help is on the way. Hold on." But before Tom could finish, the leader raised his hand, signaling to one of his men, who stepped forward and kicked the radio from James's hand. The device shattered on the ground. "You won't be getting any help, James," the leader said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. James's mind was running out of options. But he had one last card to play. In one swift motion, he dropped to one knee and fired the rifle into the snow at the leader's feet. The loud shot echoed through the forest, and the men froze, momentarily stunned. "That was a warning," James said, his voice low and deadly. "If you come any closer, I'll make sure the next shot counts." For a long moment, no one moved. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground in a thick, heavy blanket. James's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with a sudden, sharp motion, the leader raised his hand again. "Retreat," he ordered, and the men slowly backed away, keeping their eyes on James as they melted back into the trees. James kept his rifle aimed at them until they were gone, the echo of their footsteps disappearing into the distance. His pulse was still racing, but he didn't lower the gun. Not yet. Only when the snow around him had settled into an eerie silence did James finally allow himself to breathe. He'd survived, barely. But he knew this was far from over. Whoever they weren't finished with him. And as he stood alone in the snowy clearing, the wind picking up again, he realized that the tower might have been the one place he thought he could escape. But it had just become the most dangerous place of all. Ryan had been working on the lookout tower for a few days now. The isolation of the winter forest was both peaceful and unsettling, offering him a much-needed escape from his recent life turmoil. He had been through a rough divorce and job loss, and the quiet solitude of the forest felt like a chance to heal. The tower, situated deep in the woods, was far from the nearest town, and the only company he had was his thoughts, and the occasional radio check-in with his colleague, Tom, back at the main station. It was a typical winter morning. Snow blanketed the ground, and the sky was a dull gray. Ryan was standing at the top of the tower, scanning the horizon. The trees were heavy with snow, and the only sound was the gentle creaking of the wood as the wind whistled through the branches. He had just finished checking the equipment on the east side of the tower when he heard something strange. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the noise grew louder and more distinct. Footsteps. Someone was walking in the snow below, moving deliberately but quietly. Ryan froze, his heart racing. The nearest road was miles away, and there was no one else scheduled to be out here. He quickly grabbed the radio and pressed the button, his voice low but urgent. "Tom, do you copy? This is Ryan. I think there's someone here. Can you check the logs? Over." He waited, but there was no response. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The footsteps were getting closer now, crunching through the snow. Ryan gripped his rifle, keeping it low, and began to climb down the tower slowly. He moved as quietly as possible, his boots sinking into the snow with each step. His breath was visible in the frigid air as he crouched behind a tree, scanning the area below. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. Then, he saw him. A man was walking toward the base of the tower, his face obscured by a thick scarf, but his movements were deliberate. Ryan couldn't make out any details, but something about the man's presence felt wrong. He wasn't supposed to be there. "Hey!" Ryan called out, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Stop right there." The man froze, then slowly turned around. Ryan could see the confusion on his face as the stranger hesitated. "Who are you?" Ryan demanded, his grip on the rifle tightening. The man raised his hand slowly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said in a low voice. "I got lost. My truck broke down, and I've been walking for hours. I just need some help." Ryan narrowed his eyes, not lowering the rifle. His gut told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "How did you get this far out here? There's no road for miles." The man seemed to hesitate, then looked around nervously. "I didn't expect to end up this far off course. My truck. It was farther down the road. I've just been walking. Please, I'm not dangerous." Ryan didn't lower the rifle, but he did take a step back, studying the man carefully. Something still felt off, but the stranger seemed genuinely desperate. "I'm going to call this in," Ryan said, his voice steady, though he didn't trust the situation. He reached for the radio again, but as he did, a loud crack echoed from the device, signaling that it had died. His heart skipped a beat. No radio. He was alone with a stranger in the woods, and he couldn't get in touch with anyone. "Look, I swear I'm not here to hurt you," the man insisted, his voice almost pleading. "I just need a place to stay until the storm passes." Ryan took a slow breath. He wasn't sure what to do. It was too risky to let the man get closer, but he also didn't want to escalate the situation if the stranger was telling the truth. Just as he was about to speak again, the distant sound of a car engine hummed through the trees. Both Ryan and the man turned toward the noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. Ryan's pulse quickened. "You're not the only one here," he muttered, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The engine grew louder, and soon a dark SUV came into view, slowly making its way down the narrow, snow-covered path that led to the tower. The man looked at Ryan, his face now pale, his eyes wide with something resembling fear. "Who's that?" Ryan asked, keeping his rifle aimed at the stranger. The man took a step back, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. You don't understand. They're here for me. Before he could finish, the SUV came to a halt, and two men dressed in dark clothing stepped out, their faces hidden by scarves and hats. They didn't look like rescue workers. Ryan's grip tightened on his rifle as one of the men approached. "You've got him," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. "We'll take it from here." Ryan's mind raced. This was no simple lost traveler. Whoever these men were, they were here for something, or someone, far more sinister than a breakdown. "What's going on here?" Ryan demanded, not lowering his rifle. The man smirked. "You really have no idea, do you?" He nodded toward the stranger. "This man has something we need, and you've been interfering." Ryan's thoughts flashed to the tower. It wasn't just a lookout post, it was more than that. It was part of something bigger. Something much darker. "Leave now, or I'll fire," Ryan said, his voice cold. The man didn't flinch. "You'll do nothing," he replied, pulling something from his jacket pocket. Ryan's instinct screamed at him to act, but before he could raise the rifle, everything went dark.